Good afternoon and welcome, everybody. My name is James Simpson. I'm the chair of the Harvard English department. I never met Sacvan Bercovitch, but after hearing and reading all the wonderful and touching and illuminating things that have been said about him since December the 9th, I feel quite certain that Sacvan Bercovitch was one of the best colleagues that I never had. It's the privilege of the English department to be able to offer this space and time for those of you who were his friends and colleagues to be able to celebrate and remember him. I'm particularly grateful to each of you for coming, but I'd like to thank Susan Misrucci in particular for the sedulous care with which she has shaped this afternoon's program. Thank you very much, Susan. It's my pleasure to ask Wendy Martin to come up and offer the first remembrance. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Wendy Martin, and I am here from the Department of English at the Claremont Graduate University, where Sacvan received his PhD. I'm here to represent the university and to honor Sacvan's extraordinary achievements as a scholar and teacher. We are all extremely proud that Sacvan was one of our graduates. He's clearly our most illustrious model, and the students are just in awe, and he's an inspiring example to them, so I really just want people to know how deeply honored we are to be represented here today, and to be able to talk about what a wonderful scholar Sacvan was. In 2012, I invited Sacvan to lecture at CGU, and it was at the time he was a student. Is the photograph where he's in front of a beautiful green blossoming tree. That's Claremont. I recognize, very characteristic bush, so I recognized it. He told the students at CGU when he visited in 2012 that Claremont had changed his life. He said that he'd come not really understanding what academic life was about. He didn't even know that one could be a scholar, that one could be paid to do research and spend time in libraries and write and teach students about what you learned. And it was all a revelation to him. And he said, Claremont taught me how to be a scholar. They gave me an opportunity to have a completely different life than I ever imagined for myself. Well, of course, that's something we love to hear. Any university would. Finally, Sacvan was a wonderful mentor to me. When I was an assistant professor working on an American triptych, as an assistant professor, I was, of course, as uncertain as most are. And I was working on the lives and work of Adrienne Rich, Emily Dickinson, and Anne Bradstreet. And I can say that the vision of that book was inspired by the Puritan origins of the American self. And so I'm personally deeply, very grateful for Sacvan's support as well as his model of scholarship. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Chris Luby. I teach at UCLA, and I was one of Sacvan's dissertation students at Columbia. I first met Sacvan on the page. I think some of you must have done so too. I was a senior in college, 1978 or 79, and like others who will go to grad school but don't know it yet, I was fond of browsing the aisles of the university bookstore, especially the Lit Crit and American Studies sections. This was at Washington University in St. Louis, and I like to think that another student there at the time, Susan Misrucci, may have been browsing the next aisle. Whether it was the author's interesting name, Sacvan Bercovitch, or the calm authority and ambitious sweep of the book's title, The Puritan Origins of the American Self, I brought it home. I still have it, Yale University Press, third printing, 1977, $4.95. You may remember its austere midnight blue cover and the simple white Baskerville lettering, all in caps. The title promised a great deal, the definite articles calmly proposing a grand claim, The American self originated in Puritanism. When I look at it now, though, it occurs to me that it can also be read somewhat less assertively, origins in the plural, among various origins, those that are Puritan, the Puritan origins of the American self. In the book, I encountered a singular and original critical voice, the instrument of a bold and enthralling mind, learned and expert to be sure, but also, actually, as I've been revisiting it, plain-spoken, quite understated, even conversational. The book is full of unfussy declarative sentences. Here's one chosen almost at random. I quote, "Mather's assertion of representative identity marks the furthest, most audacious extension of colonial Puritan hermeneutics." Later on, when for a brief time I worked for Sackie as a research assistant, I saw how painstakingly that style was crafted. Before the virtual cut and paste of word processing, I'm dating myself there, he would have me type a manuscript, then he would literally cut, paste, revise again, then return a complicated multi-layered palimpsest to me for retyping, whereupon the process would begin again on the clean copy. So among many important things I learned from Sackie, this was not the least, the careful, dedicated craft of scholarly composition. But I'm getting just a little bit ahead of myself. I brought the book home, as I said, started reading, and didn't stop. I read straight through to its magnificent peroration, the stunning final chapter on the myth of America, with its procession of figures, Freneau and Brackenridge, Edward Bellamy, George Bancroft, Jonathan Edwards, Abraham Lincoln, Emerson, Whitman, Hawthorne, and many others. Here's Sackie again, quote, "Every stage of this long development bespeaks the astonishing tenacity of the myth." I was reminded of the greedy excitement with which I read this book at the time, when a young friend of mine recently, hearing the news of Sackie's death, wrote to me, and he recalled staying up all night in grad school to read The Office of the Scarlet Letter. Not long after reading his book, good fortune introduced me to Sackie himself. I had stayed on for a year for a master's degree in a new program in literature and history, and one of the features of the program was a methods seminar to which a series of eminent visitors was invited, and Sackie was one of them. So you can understand how eagerly I looked forward to his appearance. I had many fine teachers at Washington University, but Sackie was strikingly different. Of course, as everybody here knows, he was brilliant and charismatic, but also, it seemed to me, a bit shy, modest. The word winsome comes to my mind for some reason, yet a very strenuous thinker who took palpable pleasure in intellectual engagement. Asked a question, he listened carefully, paused, tilted his head a little, gazed upwards and to the side, smiled gently. Maybe you can conjure that expression of his. I see a version of it actually in the heartbreaking photograph of a young Sacvan Bercovitch on the program here. Sackie gave a lecture, met with our seminar, spoke very kindly to me, encouraged me to apply to grad school. And the next thing I remember, I was in his classroom at Columbia and on Riverside Drive for the meetings of his extracurricular seminar, Columbus Circle. So I mustn't take more than my share of time here, but having told you about my first memories of Sackie, here's my last. This past summer in Los Angeles, when he came along while Susan promoted her Brando book, he told me how harrowing his illness had been the previous winter, and said very plainly and simply that he felt sure he would not survive another such ordeal. But at the same time, he radiated real happiness. He said he felt a kind of happiness he'd never felt before. We spoke of the things we were grateful for. He felt he had so much good fortune. There was a very beautiful serenity about him that day, an unforgettable aura of acceptance and satisfaction. And I quote from him again, "I have lived a life," he said, with simple, declarative precision. Yes, he lived a life.
I feel very privileged and honored that Saki's family asked me to speak here today. My name is Patricia Williams. I teach at Columbia Law School. And many of you have spent much more time with Saki than I, perhaps as doctoral students or as colleagues. But even though that was not my good fortune, he and his work profoundly changed my life to a degree that is belied by the brevity of time I actually spent studying with him. Indeed, it was really only a month and a half. The 6 weeks of the School of Criticism and Theory in 1987, in his class on the American Jeremiad. But his work struck a chord that changed the course of my career, which till then had been quite a cheerless one, teaching agricultural contracts, medical and pharmaceutical contracts, and the Uniform Commercial Code. Indeed, the only reason I ended up at the School of Criticism and Theory was because I was looking for escape, and a summer studying Puritan America actually seemed like an escape at that grim moment in my life. Luckily, it was that and much more. As I think Sacvan knew, because I never stopped telling him over all the years since, he was quietly but hugely influential in my life. And that summer was like the throwing open of a window onto a thought world of greenest spring, a bloom with endless configurations. I climbed out that window and ran away from my professional home into an intellectual vista from which I have never turned back. And even though I'm technically still teaching in a law school, I don't believe I've ever taught the Uniform Commercial Code again. Sacvan pushed me to write my first book. He founded a publisher. I think he personally took it over to Harvard Press. And I have been writing outside legal conventions ever since. I teach friskily and interdisciplinarily. I am happy. And I mentioned at the tribute to him a few years ago that I enjoy a weird genealogy of very old New England and the legacy of the slave trade. And I was brought up in Boston at a time when the school system required memorization and recitation of long polemics by Winthrop and Cotton and Danforth. My privileged but joyless education presented a world that had no norm but exceptionalism, no fair average of its own, never mind a room of my own. And to visit those Puritan texts anew through Sacvan's eyes, rather than those of an obedient schoolgirl, was an inspiring surprise. Professor Bercovich's complex relationship to his own identity, as summarized by Werner Sollers, that of always feeling like an immigrant or a hero in a Kafka novel, it helped me to recognize the sources of that learned exile in my own life. And as rooted an American as I am also that startled immigrant, if an immigrant to the familiar, placeless and unmoored, even in a landscape of the intimately known. And although I've expressed this much in terms of a personal trajectory in the wilderness, of course it's really about an American narrative that places us all a little bit outside ourselves, always a little bit beyond or behind the present moment, a design creating what Sacvan once called a specific set of anticipations. And I've tried to honor his insights about symbolic forms of exclusion and inclusion and exceptionalism and bring them to the field of language, of legal language, that is to say, playing with them in the context of race, gender, bioethics, legal subjectivity, and personhood. Anyway, there are teachers, and there are great teachers. Understated, witty, profound, Sacvan Bercovitch was an extraordinary teacher and a generous mentor. And I think there is a special place in the cosmos for those whose slightest push, whose quietest instruction results in such deep reverberation that it changes lives forever. I'm tremendously grateful to Saki for his presence in my life, his wisdom, his kindness, his gentle luminance echo always in my mind and in my heart.
Eifenfurel liegt das Kälbel, liegt gebunden mit der Strick. Euch in Himmel flieht das Schwälbel, dreht sich hin und krieg. Lacht der Wind in Chören, lacht und lacht und lacht. Lacht der Tage ganzen mit der halben Nacht. Donna, 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 donna.
Schreit das Kälbel, sagt der Bäuer, welche heißt dich seiner Kalb? Wollst gekehrt zu seiner Vogel, wollst gekehrt zu seiner Schwalbe.
Bidne Kälber tut men binden, und men schleppt sie und men schächt. Wer's hat Fliegel flieht, räuft zu, is bei keinem nicht kein Knecht. Lacht der Wind in Chören, lacht und lacht und lacht, lacht der Tage ganzen mit der halben Nacht. Donna, 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 donna. Lacht der Wind in Chören, lacht und lacht und lacht, lacht der Tage ganzen mit der halben Nacht. Donna, 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 donna.
I find that the deeper my affection for someone I've lost is, the harder it is to speak about, the more inadequate words become to what I would like to express. Philosophers, and that's my profession, have been wrestling with the subject of friendship since ancient times. And yet Plato and Aristotle, unparalleled as they were, somehow seem to me to miss the boat when it comes to friendship. They, and especially Aristotle, over-intellectualize it, perhaps because they over-intellectualize human life itself. The special bond one feels with a truly special friend defies intellectual analysis. For me, such a bond began with my first acquaintance with Saki, which happened around the time we retired. I retired in 2000 and Saki in 2001. I remember that it was Stanley Cavell who brought us together. And we met, Saki and I met many times, both at our houses and in more recent years at the Pamplona coffee shop in Harvard Square. There were common interests. We both had radical parents, and we were both interested in the history and after effects of left-wing thought. He was an English professor, and I was the son of a writer. We both had acquired deepening commitments to and interest in Judaism well after childhood, and there were also intriguing differences that we explored between his Montreal childhood and my own childhood in France and in the United States. So there was plenty of conversational material from the start. And as everyone here knows, Saki was warm, friendly, and brilliant. And that amazing smile, that wonderful laugh. But all this only explains why I liked him and enjoyed his company, but not why my feeling of friendship developed in such a very deep affection. I put down Plato and Aristotle a few moments ago for over-intellectualizing friendship, which they saw as based on admiration for virtue. But they were not wholly wrong. I take it back in part. Friendship begins with a pre-rational elective affinity, or so it seems to me. But if it is to last and deepen, there has to be an admiration for virtue, though perhaps not too much virtue, or not too much admiration. And I think that the virtue I especially admired in Saki was his genuineness. There was nothing of the poseur about Saki. Everything he felt and thought was sincere. He was not one to show off, as are even some of the great names in the academy. I have the impression that Saki knew how brilliant he was, but it was not something he thought about. He was neither vain nor humble. Rather, he was remarkably free of narcissism. In old-fashioned language, Saki had a schöne Seele, a beautiful soul.
Faced with the injunction to be laconic, I'm reminded of Saki's own tip of the iceberg self-presentation, and I feel defeated in advance. What I'd do if I could, if I had his gifts, would be to distill my sense of the man, my good friend, and at the same time indicate how and why the man and the work, so indissolubly intertwined, the one feeding the other, keep on expanding to my astonished gaze. I knew him for years, from the time he came to Harvard. That is, I thought I knew him for years. But since he died, I've come to know him more fully, to love and respect him even more deeply, and that transcending of what I thought I knew, that folding in of opposites, I now recognize as his ongoing gift to me, and not to me alone. Over 3 decades, we talked regularly, picking up where we'd left off, but at irregular intervals. In conversation, he was congenial, humorous, paradoxical, quick to appreciate absurdity, the opposite of a holder forth, preferring pregnant silences to monologues, at once frank and sly. I remember his mentioning matter-of-factly that he had received some particularly prestigious award, and then pausing thoughtfully before adding with downcast eyes and a self-deprecating little smile, "I'm trying to let it go to my head." He was warm, but at the same time elusive, and yet it became clear over time that these qualities arose from the depth of his seriousness, just as his frequent unpredictability arose from his hard-won steadiness and integrity. In his work, once he finished analyzing a phenomenon, he was immediately moved to consider the insufficiency of that analysis unless the complementary truths of its obverse, or alternatives, were considered as well. I've been in touch recently with 2 of his former graduate students, and I'd like to cite their grateful testimony on this score. One of them recalls her first visit to his office on the top floor of Warren House, its walls, quote, completely covered with postcards from former and current students sent from all over the world. She was, she says, intimidated instantly. But she goes on, before I knew it, we were talking about most moving early years reading. I about crying, age 13, over Friday's death and sea burial in Robinson Crusoe. Saki about crying, age 15, over Catherine's death in Wuthering Heights. I was astonished to hear about that kind of relationship to reading from a then middle-aged male Harvard professor. I tell this anecdote to my students often to remind them to stay connected to the emotional, visceral part of reading, even in the midst of crafting analytical arguments about literature, end quote. As for his lectures, she underlines how they, I quote again, how they modeled what then seemed an impossible mastery of the materials, of course, but perhaps more importantly, of approach, of engagement, of ongoing on-the-spot conversation with a text, a series of texts, an idea, or a series of ideas, with a discursive context, with a broader culture. They showed us how to be in a world of thinking people, how to see the world, past and present, as a world of people thinking as if their life depended on it. Another former graduate student recalls a seminar, quote, in which we read a fair amount of high theory, and some students seemed to be using their facility with this kind of scholarship to bully other students. One rather bitter argument was punctuated by a furious student hissing at another, "What has this to do with Billy Budd?" This was the point at which Saki, hunched low in his chair and with his fingertips pressed together, I remember, she says, because at that moment he reminded me of the Buddha, issued a defense of difficult theory that was expressed in blessedly non-difficult language. To me, this was very important because I was not one of the students who felt an immediate comfort with, say, deconstruction. So his lucid defense helped me to stick with it and learn something rather than rejecting it all as pretension, which it sometimes was on the part of certain students. End of quote. Sacvan Bercovitch's extraordinary presence, no less than his extraordinary writing, was a gift to his students quite as much as to his friends. All of us who knew him have reason to be lastingly grateful.
I never knew anyone like him, brilliant and incredibly sharp in his critical eye, yet not only warm and personal, but almost instantly and vulnerably intimate with others. How deeply mistrustful he could be of American politics, how sarcastically he could mimic and repeat the phrase, "change you can believe in," a phrase he hated so much that he traced it to a 4th of July oration from 1850. How skeptical he was of all institutions, including universities, and the culture of faculty meetings. How sharply critical of all academic fashions, from new criticism, where he says interpretation can be mystification, and Cold War American studies, a version of the Marshall Plan, to contemporary pseudo-left-wing celebrity culture whose participants, he said, may have missed their calling as investment bankers. Yet how seriously devoted he was to the radicalism of his scholarship, while offering learned readings with his modest self-stylization as an outsider, as a Canadian Jewish immigrant taking a journey into the American self. How his face lit up in his role as an eagerly mischievous teller of jokes, of shaggy dog or off-color stories, or when he related strange events in his own life and travels, sometimes as if it weren't even his own life, is the way he talked about it. How absolutely devoted he was to his family, to his late wife Gila and their son Eitan, to Susan, his widow, and their son Sasha, taking genuine pride and talking at great detail about Eitan's anthropological fieldwork in Papua New Guinea, or Sasha's Latin American researches, Gila's role at the Library of America, and Susan's excellent scholarship and intellectual companionship. How supportive he was of his sisters Sylvia and Ninel, how proud of his father's paintings, how protective he also was of his academic family of students and friends, a family of which I was lucky enough to become a member. How could anyone not love him? I met Saki 39 years ago. He was just about at the peak of his career, beginning to be at the peak of his career, the Puritan origins of the American Self. I still have the edition with the errata slip in it, was coming out, and I was a freshly baked Berlin PhD and beginning assistant professor at Columbia. I had read some of his work and was simply in awe of his scholarship. At its core was, to me, Saki's question, by what rhetorical magic had the Puritan influence issued in that charismatic identity no less appealing abroad as the golden door of opportunity than it was internally as a summons to national unity. Anticipating, therefore, a discussion about the abiding legacy of Puritanism in American literature, I was surprised to find him wishing to chat about movies instead, giving lavish and ironic plot summaries and sounding gleefully incredulous that films like The Stepford Wives should actually exist. He wondered who my favorite Hollywood actresses were, and when it finally came to scholarly matters, he asked me for advice. Our first meeting turned out to be the beginning of a free-floating conversation that we were to continue over the years and decades to come. Saki, who loved weird postcards, country music, hotel key cards, I don't know where to send them now, cartoons, jokes, and gossip, and I would take long, long walks, especially in New York, and while marveling how in a rational city grid, each block could be so different from the previous and the next one, he told me stories of his childhood, of being placed in a foster home, working in a supermarket, of finding his way to college, of the illness and death of his daughter, of his own uncurable sleeplessness. And I felt that I could talk with him about anything, could absolutely confide in him. When I was hit by a car in Germany, he called me in the hospital every day. What a demonstration of friendship. And we kept on talking and talking. His long years of illness and patient suffering made for more interruptions in our meetings, but talk we did. And the last time we saw each other, last October, Saki described Padenie Berlina, a Stalinist film about World War II, a melodrama, and he described it so vividly that I watched it the moment I got home, and it fulfilled all the expectations that his narrative had given me. But it is his charming musical voice, his power as a conversationalist, that I can hear when I reread his books, as I've done recently, in my dramatically underlined copies. In The American Jeremiad, for example, he describes the Americanizing power of the fire and brimstone rhetoric turned into promise as a web spun out of sacred history and middle-class ideology which allowed virtually no avenue of escape. And in The Rites of Assent, I can hear Saki's voice again when taking his point of departure from Franz Kafka's Investigations of a Dog. He writes, "If dreams of transcendence are indices to the traps of culture, then inquiry into the trapping process may provide insight into our own and into others' actual non-transcending condition." In his condensed, clear writing, he makes us wonder whether we have all been engaged in a game of chess, the rules of which can change while the game is still going on. It has been hard for me to write about my best friend Saki in the past tense, which may be why I switched to the present tense of quotations from his work. Memories from nearly 40 years that we have known each other keep coming up, and Saki is so much alive in my mind that I simply cannot believe that he is no longer with us. This is a very sad season indeed, but perhaps the liveliness with which we remember him today will not only give us solace, but will also help us forget his long health troubles and suffering and see him in our mind's eye again as the whimsical, self-questioning, world-open, charming, disarming, and loving man, as the Mensch that he was.
Mizmor David, aromai roi lo echsar, binot sheyar bitzeni, al mei menuchot yenahaleni. Nafshi shovev, Nafshi shovev, yancheni b'magle tzedek, leman שמו. גם כי אלך בגץ על מוות, לא אירא רע, כי אתה עמדי. שבטך ומשענתך, שבטך ומשענתך, המה ינחמוני. תערוך לפני שולחן, לפני שולחן. תערוך לפני שולחן, נגד צורריי. דשנת ושמן ראשי, דשנת ושמן ראשי, דשנת ושמן ראשי, כוסי רוויה. אך טוב וחסד ירדפוני כל ימי חיי, ושבתי בבית אדוני, ושבתי בבית אדוני לאורך ימים.
I'm very glad for the chance today to remember Sackie with so many others here, lucky enough, like I was, to know his great warmth, brilliance, and humor. I'm glad others have talked about his work, which meant so much to me, but I'm moved to share two personal memories that capture for me the distinctive, wonderful person he was as I knew him. I met Sackie when I was 21 years old and had just left my home state of Utah to come to Cambridge for graduate school. He eventually became my teacher and mentor, and together with Susan, was a pivotal part of my life in Massachusetts and beyond. More than any single person, Sackie was the intellectual entry point for a career that took me to Boston University and Penn. But he also provided a unique cultural entry. He was the somewhat unlikely Virgil to my Dante, a guide not to the underworld, certainly, but to the world of East Coast academia, so different from what I knew before graduate school. When I arrived at Harvard, I met many wonderful, generous people, some who remain close friends today, but they had very little idea about the culture of Utah or even the Mountain West, and were politely reticent about even discussing it. So I was something of a stranger in a strange land. I had no reason to think that would be any different with my professors, certainly not the professor with the unusual name who taught my Melville seminar. So imagine my surprise then when I made an appointment with Sackie to discuss my seminar presentation, climbed the many flights of stairs to his attic office, and sat down facing the wall of his office, which, as you've already heard, was covered with images of all kinds, postcards, drawings, and prints of paintings. There, just to the left of a New Yorker cartoon, was an illustration I had seen many times about a myth of America that no one else at Harvard seemed to have heard of, The story in the Book of Mormon telling of how the resurrected Christ appeared in ancient America in 1 AD. That was quite a surprise. It was also the beginning of many wonderful discussions with Sackie about American history, religion, and mythic narrative, and I'll always treasure those discussions. Finding someone who is not just knowledgeable, but also curious and willing to make warm, irreverent jokes about my world made me feel fully recognized for perhaps the first time in graduate school. And that in turn helped me learn so much from Sackie about the world I was entering and its myths, texts, and shaping stories. When the news of Sackie's death became known, many of his colleagues and students began sharing memories and tributes. A former graduate student in our cohort, Carol Ann Johnson, mentioned one that struck a chord. She described looking out of the window of Mather Dining Hall one evening and seeing Sackie, as she put it, shooting baskets in his dress clothes and shoes with the neighborhood lads. The image of him interrupting intellectual work for a spontaneous, joyous act reminded me of one spring day at the end of the Melville seminar. We'd been discussing the dark, beautiful tragedies of Melville's fiction, which Sackie, in his inimitable way, had helped us to see were even more tragic than we had suspected. The seminar over, we all walked out into the sunny green yard on the first really warm day of the semester. As we all began going our separate ways, I happened to see Sackie pause, smile that smile, and fling his set of keys high into the air, like Mary Tyler Moore throwing her hat into the air at the beginning of a television show. The keys finally dropped back down, he caught them, and continued on his way. I'll always remember Sackie as someone who, in one brief hour, could condense intellectual brilliance, keen awareness of human tragedy, and then sheer exuberance at walking outside on the first warm day of spring. I have not met anyone since with just that combination of intensely lived qualities, and I don't expect to. I will always count it my great good fortune to have known him.
I've been asked to begin by identifying my relationship with Sackie. It's not so easy to do that. I'm a doctor, and we often spoke about his health, but I wasn't Sackie's doctor. I did take a single extension school course from him, so you couldn't say I was a student in the way that many here were his students. And we were friends, but between our schedules and sadly his health, we really met very few times. And yet we were very close. And I've been thinking about why that was. And I think it's because we shared a great love of Jewish jokes. Not just the jokes, which we traded constantly when we didn't meet by email, but the cadences, the inflections, the sensibility of Jewish humor. The extension course I took from him, which I think was in about 2008, was Jewish modernism. And I think our friendship began when I was working on my first short paper, which I proposed to him might be an exploration of the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, as an elaborate Jewish joke. How we laughed over that. I remember Sackie saying, "All that schlepping for nothing." My final paper, he, at this point, I think mischievously encouraged me to take on a comparison of Kafka's Metamorphosis and Portnoy's Complaint. One time, we were having lunch at Grafton Street here in the square, and I confided in Sackie that I had a problem with someone I considered a friend, and he said, "What's the problem?" I said, "I told him one of my favorite jokes, and he didn't get it. I just don't know what that means for our friendship." And Sackie said, "Well, what was the joke?" And I said, "Well, it was the one about the Yenta who goes to the Vatican, and she comes home, and another Yenta says, 'So what did you think of the Pope?' And she says, 'He was a doll, but her I didn't care for.'" And Sackie said, "This man, he didn't think that was funny?" I said, "No, he kept saying everybody knows the Pope's not married." And Sackie said, "I don't think you could be friends with such a person." I visited Sackie 1 week to the day before he died. It was 4 o'clock on a December evening. The room was dark already. We sat down, I on the couch and he on the chair. And he did this thing that he did, this physical preamble to speech. He went, and then he said, "So, I'm in hospice." And then he proceeded to tell me that he had no pain and no fear. And he spoke about his impending death with remarkable directness. And then there was a pause. And I asked him a question which seemed to me entirely relevant under the circumstance, given how much he adored his family, Susan, his sons. And I said, "So Sackie, is your son still in South America?" And he smiled that feline smile. And he said, "Look how she changes the subject." And then we did change the subject, and he asked me about my writing. I had been sending him for a few years excerpts of a memoir I was working on about my father, a fascinating and mysterious character. And he asked me how that was going, and I told him, in fact, I had abandoned the whole project because I realized that my mother was actually much more interesting, and I started writing about her. And we laughed about the old joke about the guy who's in analysis for decades and then one day realizes he actually is obsessed with the other parent. And then at a little before 5, he walked me to the door and he hugged me and he said, "I'm proud of you. You're really doing it. You're taking care of yourself." And I knew exactly what he meant, and I knew that it had nothing to do with diet and exercise. I knew what he meant. And I said, "I'll see you again soon." And he said, "Sure you will." And I sure do, every day.
Sackie delighted in telling the story of how he came to publish his first article. He was told that all you have to do, just read widely the scholarship in the field and you'll learn how people do it. And this made sense to him. And he did. And he produced his first manuscript and then decided to make a list of all the journals that he would wish it to appear in rank order, most important, down to the one that If need be, that's where it would be published, and sent it to each one in order, and each one rejected it. Until he got to the end of the list, and they'd all rejected it. So what did he do? He went back to the top of the list and sent the same manuscript to the top one, which accepted it. And so was born a great career. Now, I think from that story, we see two extraordinary attributes of our friend, this wonderful man. The understanding that he came to glean from being an outsider, and this almost inexplicable quiet strength that supported him in everything he did. And the connection between these two, I believe, is key to understanding what was core to his being and what I shall miss the most. Now, it's not obvious that this red diaper baby from Canada with the unlikely but marvelous name should become one of the keenest observers of American culture, but perhaps it should have been. Not having been raised on the American myth, he was not driven down one of the two paths that we all know so well. One, to have one's understanding compromised by a conscious, or more likely unconscious, refraction of reality through the lens created by that myth. Or the other, perhaps more common by those of us in the academy, in the words that Cranley used to describe Daedalus in Portrait of the Artist as a young man, to be so filled with that which you reject. But he was neither. Instead, he was able to observe American culture with the widest lens, or perhaps better put, with a lens with the least distortion of anyone I have ever met or shall ever meet. Hence the clarity of the vision, which is why when reading his writings or engaging him in conversation, and how interesting that as you've heard the words shared today, some of us met him through the words on the page, some of us met him through the words in conversation, but we all were drawn to the vision. There was the classic sign of genius, the sense not only that his perception was clearly correct, but that he was telling you things you already knew. It's just that you didn't know it until he told you that you knew it. And then you had that epiphany moment. The clarity of that vision that comes from having been an outsider could make one a cynic, but there was nothing cynical about Sackie. Skeptical, yes. Sarcastic, absolutely. Cynical, never. He left the kibbutz, but he never lost his deep connection with Israel and his concern for what Israel is, and more to the point, what it could be. He exposed the myth that surrounded the Pilgrim generation and those myths that grew out of it, from manifest destiny to American exceptionalism, but he never lost a delight in what was possible here in this country. And he succeeded in this country for that reason in such an extraordinary way. And he grew up with the insecurity of a foster childhood experience, but never lost the belief that security was possible and was in fact a gift that we give to each other, and that he himself could give so abundantly. And more than anything, I think, that was the source of that otherwise inexplicable quiet strength. That which he had been denied, he knew he could bestow, and in doing so, create a kind of security for himself. It came from what he gave us. He was not, classically speaking, a religious man. He told me once, "I don't believe in God, but I want to believe in God." And I told him, That's okay. I happen to believe that God believes in you. So no, he was not a cynic. I think of him rather as a cheerful existentialist, one who takes great joy in the potential of each moment. With Sackie, there was never a scarcity. In his world, there was enough credit to go around. And he could take great joy in the accomplishments of others without fear that somehow this would limit his own. I know I speak for, I think, all of us if I refer to my own sheer joy in watching the appreciation he took in engaging with each of my children, and watching his appreciation for Kathy's graduate work and scholarly career in which he took such great pride. Susan, you would never have known that you were Kathy's advisor, not Sackie. And we know that what he felt for all of us was a fraction of what he felt for Eitan and Sasha, and of course Susan. With Sackie, there was not a scarcity of love either. I thought of him last Shabbat when we read Shir HaShirim on the Shabbat during Pesach. Love indeed is as strong as death, maybe stronger. With Sackie, there was always enough love to go around. And this explains the exceptional generosity of spirit that we all benefited from. And it explains the twinkle in the eye and the smile that started small and then slowly lit up the entire room. And it explains the ability to bring a deep and sometimes cutting critique without a trace of meanness. And it explains how the man who grew up with such insecurity gave security to so many. Once an outsider, he became the kind of insider who matters the most. Someone whose wit, wisdom, kindness, and joy will dwell within all of us who are fortunate enough to know him and to have him in our lives. When Herbert Marcuse passed away, there was a wonderful observation in his obituary that said, "It's hard to imagine Marcuse dead. Sartre, yes. Marcuse, no." It went on to describe him as a buoyant pessimist. It's hard to imagine Sacvan Bercovitch gone. He was my cheerful existentialist.
Die Sonne wird heruntergehen hinterm Berg, wird kommen a Stille, die Liebe zu gehen. Wird kommen a Stille, die Liebe zu gehen zum Ummet, wo es sitzt auf a goldenem Stein und weint vor sich einem allein. Die Sonne wird heruntergehen hinterm Berg, wird kommen die goldene Pave zu fliehen. Wird kommen die goldene Pave zu fliehen und mitnehmen wird sie uns alle hin, wo die Bänkschaft wird ziehen. Die Sonne wird heruntergehen hinterm Berg, wird kommen die Nacht und wird singen Lulu. Wird kommen die Nacht und wird singen Lulu, rüber die Augen, was fallen schon zu schlafen in ewiger Ruhe. The sun will soon set and sink neath the hill, and quietly, quietly, love will appear at the golden stone where sits sorrow alone and sheds lonely tears of her woe. The sun will soon set and sink neath the hill, and the golden peacock will come on its wings to carry us all to that place far away where our hearts yearn truly to be. The sun will soon set and sink neath the hill, and night will come nigh to sing us Lulu, as eyes ever weary grow heavy and close to rest in eternal repose. The golden peacock, with its magic and brilliance, its sadness and lament, is a frequent metaphor of Yiddish poetry and song. The trope harkens back to the Bible, to the promise of a land beyond the horizon, perhaps even to Jerusalem on a hill. Of course, tales of the Golden Peacock are, as Sacchi might have phrased it, entirely far-fetched. Indeed, Sacchi taught us to say that word anew with its a Yiddish intonation, and thereby to see the world anew. With his outsider's perspective, Sacchi developed a depth of perception and honed an acuteness of vision that led a geographical and cultural immigrant, whose very name traced his far-left lineage, to grasp and understand the Puritans of New England, and through them, America itself. Quite far-fetched, as Sacchi might have phrased it. A man who came in from the Canadian cold and became the ultimate insider. San Diego, Brandeis, Columbia, Harvard, and now sadly, Memorial Church. And yet, throughout his life and work, Sacchi maintained a steadfast, ironic distance. To quote Sacchi himself, as a scholar he wrote, "I continue to keep my skeptical distance from that American self." And Sacchi combined that with an engaged and joyous sense of the world and its foibles. Wonderful spices for a remarkable life. When I once commented on his highly sought-after parking spot near the English department offices in Harvard Yard, he chortled, that was the job offer from Berkeley. Sacchi saw his work and commitments altogether seriously and rigorously, yet was able to extract the joy of the moment and living and the humor just beneath the surface of the world he inhabited. His rich and masterly oeuvre in American studies and literature was bookended by his early translations of the stories of Sholem Aleichem and the ballads of Itzik Manger, and by his more recent and unpublished work on the modern Jewish cultural renaissance. Sacchi was himself an offspring and exemplar of that explosion of creativity, a man whose genius wove myriad strands of complex identity, historic vision, and hermeneutic mastery into a brilliant tapestry of scholarship and life. Quite far-fetched, as Sacchi might have phrased it. So how can we now honor Sacchi's memory? By recalling his serious purpose as an academic, his impish glee of being in the world, and his warmth and commitment as a friend. We can best remember Sacchi by celebrating his legacy and living his lessons. May Sacchi's memory be a blessing for us all.
What happens if history severs the logos from the logocracy, the symbol from the nation? It's a prospect that returns us full circle to the Puritan discovery 3.5 centuries ago. I said at the start that the Puritans not only brought the Bible to America, but America to the Bible. But what if you get to the Bible and America doesn't exist? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with the Bible, and the Word was the Bible, and there was no America there. What happens if history separates America, divine plan and all, from the United States? Nothing much. Only relativism, the day-by-day grind, the facts of fragmentation, a certain modesty about the boundaries of national allegiance, a more mundane distinction between the old world and the new, as denoting geographical division rather than the progress of mankind, a more traditional concept of frontiers as signifying barriers rather than a heaven-sent summons to expand, a sense of difference between liberal ideals and transcendental truth, and along along with this, perhaps, a genuine debate about cultural alternatives, none of them grounded in sacred texts, and all of them tentative and secure. In the rhetoric of Jewish cultural history, we might call this the Golaization of the United States. It is a consummation, or it could be a consummation, devoutly to be wished. It would also be the beginning of a new set of problems. The most immediate of these lies in another simple fact, the truism implicit in the astonishing persistence of Puritan rhetoric from Winthrop to Reagan. I mean the human need for absolutes, the persisting demand for hope and belief that is inherent in the very concept of Gola, exile, especially considered as a metaphor for our bleak modern world. The abiding demand in our age of relativism and sociobiology for symbols, myths, and ideals. What authority can replace the rhetoric of America in the United States? Granted that America, as the Puritans discovered it, was a myth designed for a certain social system, granted too what Marxists and Straussians alike have been telling us, that the system is deeply conflicted. Still, a remarkable fact of modern history has been the failure of alternative systems, including the Marxists, either to provide an adequate myth or to prove that communities can cohere without one. And until one or the other happens, America will probably endure, if only by default, as a city set upon a hill, a beacon of bourgeois biblicism for the wildering nations of the earth. Thank you. Yeah, if you have any comments, questions? Many American audience consider this, or would consider this, a hostile line of thought. It always intrigues me when Americans do, as David mentioned, I'm Canadian, so I feel objective and partial about it. Do because it's always a sign to me of how much the word America means to them. I mean, you would think in this multi-ethnic, disparate country that it wouldn't matter all that much whether an abstraction like America hangs on or doesn't hang on, as long as, for example, the way of life continues or history happens. But it does. It usually gets people very upset. And I'm not advocating it. I'm just saying that it's threatened. It's something that has people have mentioned as a possibility of occurring, and which I think is, as I say, which is inherent, a problem inherent in the myth itself, in that it's grounded in certain sacred texts, ultimately, which are not reliable. They're not reliable because there are no sacred texts with America in it, because America is the country of the modern. Yeah.
El Hecharim Me'ayin Yavo Ezri Me'imadomai Ose Shamayim Va'aretz
Shamayim va'aretz.